So, welcome again to the hands-on Purple Team workshop with SCYTHE. I will be your host, Timothy Schulz. And so for those of you that are wondering who I am, let's see if I can get this to move forward. All right. There we go. All right. This is always the fun, technical difficulties at the beginning. All right. So I'm Tim Schulz. I'm SCYTHE's Adversary Emulation Lead. Prior to SCYTHE, I've been here 7 months now. Time flies. And before that, I was at Sandia National Labs and MITRE. I was part of the attack team. I worked on attack evaluations and Caldera. So if you're familiar with those projects, Caldera was sort of my first jump into the automated adversary emulation space. And then, of course, SCYTHE is sort of the natural next step. And so I will be your tour guide through the Purple Team world today. So with the workshop, my mouse is like jumping back and forth here. So this is a hands-on workshop format. We're going to start off with just a quick lecture. You should have gotten some emails, and this is always something that I have to do a quick disclaimer on. You should get an email with a link for a lab environment from VMware Learning Platform. So check your spam, something like that, if you didn't get it. And if you did not get that email, either send something in the chat or the Q&A. And this is where our awesome support team of Elaine and George in the background will help you troubleshoot those issues while I am talking about Purple Teaming. So that's something that we want to make sure everybody, it does take a few minutes to build out that lab. So luckily I will fill that time while you're waiting. And then we will get to the lab. And so the way this works, I'll do this quick lecture. It does take probably 45 minutes worth of content here to sort of talk about Purple Teaming, how we got where we are and how we perform it. I'm also head of SCYTHE services. And so this is sort of a walkthrough of my days when I do Purple Team activities for people. And so after that, I will do a walkthrough of the lab. So if you want to sort of follow along, you can do that. If you've been to one of these before and you've already heard my pitch on Purple Teaming and all of that kind of thing, you can throw me on mute, jump into the lab and just play around with SCYTHE. And we have a workbook there and everything set up. So it should be self-guided once you get to that point, but I'm going to walk through it. I answer additional questions, that kind of thing. So if you do have any questions, feel free, put them in the chat or Q&A. George and Elaine normally answer them while I'm lecturing. And then afterward, I'll sort of jump in and we'll do a couple of sections and pause, give you some time to go through it. And that's going to be our 3 hours. So in the hands-on environment, just to give you a preview of what's coming up with that, and when you do click essentially provision, what it's going to do, you're going to have 4 different systems. You're only going to be able to see 2 of them. One of them is going to be Unicorn, which is what you're going to be spending the majority of your time on. And then the other one is a SAN Slingshot Matrix, and that's hosting things like Vector. That's also where we have our ELK stack for when we talk a little bit, touch on detection engineering, and you'll do a little bit with Kibana in the lab. So we also have a domain controller. And so if you want to mess with anything that's doing domain testing and enumeration of accounts, things like that, you can do that. So we did set it up. Everyone's got their own environment to play with, so you're not going to be messing with other attendees. So have fun. Let us know if you run into any issues in the chat and Q&A. That's going to be your primary way of getting help with that. So I'll see it eventually, but it's probably going to be after a little bit. And we want to make sure everybody can get into the lab. So with that, what are the takeaways? Let's set up expectations here. The key thing we want you to take away from this is learning about what Purple Teaming is. Purple Teaming is not just a new color on the color wheel of information security. It is about basically collaboration, communication, bringing these things together so that you not only are writing detections or defenses, but also validating those things with security testing and trying to understand what real adversaries are doing. And so that's really what we want you to take away is, what is Purple Teaming and how can I bring it back to my organization? Whether that you bring back that mindset, whether you have some new tools in your tool belt to work with. And so we also are going to provide you with a couple of resources. And so we're going to start you off with the Purple Team Exercise Framework, or PTEF, which is this is again a Scythe creation. It's free. You can go download it. I've got a link here in the slides, but it's also if you go scythe.io/PTEF, PTEF, and that will get you to the page where you can download the Purple Team exercise framework so you can follow along if you want there. We then also, this is Purple Team. It is more than just technical things. We have the Purple Maturity Model, which I'm the primary author on that sort of talks about how you can fit Purple Teaming into your strategic goals if you are trying to create like a roadmap and measuring your capability, because that's something that's every business leader and security leader tends to want, is how do we measure ourselves against what's happening in the real world. We're going to give you a couple of places where you can go get adversary emulation plans. The first one being Threat Thursday, which is where George or myself, we take our expertise, we look at some cyber threat intel, as I'll walk through in the workshop, and sort of talk about the process here. The end result is actionable emulation plans that you can use when you're testing in your organization. And then the last thing, of course, is that, this is sponsored by Scythe. I am a Scythe unicorn, as are George and Elaine. So we are going to talk about Scythe Enterprise Platform. You're going to get to use it in the lab. So a bunch of you, this may be your chance to play around with it. And this is exactly what you're going to get. So, and then the final thing is, of course, CPE credits. So this is something everyone for CISSP, I feel like any SAN certs, that kind of thing, you've got to request them now. That I think they changed that around. But basically, we do have a certificate at the end of the lab. So you do have to go through the lab in order to get this. That will give you your credits. So, and that is on the last page of the guide of the lab, just goes through how to get that. All right. So with that, let's jump right in. So what is a purple team? First of all, so we've got this new color. People are normally familiar with blue teams, which are your defenders. That's sort of how everything started. Maybe it's the chicken and the egg as far as, did you have the attackers first or the defenders? Well, you sort of need both. So that's where we have, traditionally, we've had the blue teams and the red teams, and they've sort of historically butted heads, unfortunately. And part of that is because it came out of, you essentially had the red team is sort of a military term. It's something, a team that was come in to, poke holes, find vulnerabilities, that kind of thing. And oftentimes those teams were created of a bunch of different specialists, that kind of thing. But what it sort of morphed into was a team that was constantly poking holes. And we had this communication around red and blue teams. The interaction was mostly around win or lose. And so it was sort of binary. Somebody had to win, which means somebody has to lose. And so that means anytime the red team can't get in, there's the question of value. What did the red team actually do if they couldn't get in? And then if you flip the script there and the red team gets in all the time, it's like, what is the point of doing anything in security if a red team can always get into our network? And so trying to scope or bound these things often became difficult, but then we have our friends at Cyber Threat Intelligence now that basically have added context to this. So they've added information. This is why we have this change over the past, I'd say, decade in information security, because we're adding more context to the types of tests that red teams are doing. It's not just what can the red teamers come up with, because they're often very creative people. And so they come up with some very creative tests, and maybe they're going to, they'll break in a way that nobody's seen before, whether it's a 0-day or something else. And what's the question around that is what type of testing is that? What type of value does that bring? Can you make recommendations on all the things you broke in? Do you have an understanding of what the blue team's doing in order to provide good recommendations? And so that's sort of what the cyber threat intelligence component is bringing additional context around those questions and around those conversations. So that's the three primary teams that we talk about when we talk about purple teams. So the other question is, after what it is, why should we do purple teams? And so part of the reason that I think purple teams is you can do purple teaming at any part of the kill chain, whether that's the initial infection, after the initial infection, the assumed breach, we're going to get there, but you can also do it with phishing and that kind of thing. The key thing behind this, in my mind, is the communication, the transparency around testing what you're doing. What this allows you to do is it allows you to train the blue team. Anytime you're able to expose and showcase what types of tests you're doing, why they work, that is spreading knowledge. It's giving more people in the organization. If you're an outside person, for instance, coming into an organization, or if you're two internal teams doing testing, you will be able to impart some new knowledge, and then you can also figure out how those defenders work. And so there's this give and take that happens that we don't always see with red and blue teams. And so this is where purple teaming sort of unites everybody together. And so the other thing is testing the processes between security teams. This is something that often when doing security testing sort of falls, everyone's focused on the technical aspects. Did this tool pick this technique up? Was the red team able to exploit this technique? And basically it all falls to security controls and tuning and things like that. But the processes between teams, because a lot of times, for instance, we have, I think it's MITRE was one of the first that has the book and the paper on the three-tier SOC. And so how do we make sure that the processes between escalation of those teams is working as intended? How do you test that? And I think purple teaming is that answer for that as well. And then the last couple here, just to sort of check the boxes, is you can test new attack chains and you don't have to worry about setting up a lab environment. If you're the red team, you're familiar with this process. You set up your own environment, you're trying to test this out, and then you're trying to get it to a point where it's hopefully repeatable enough that it'll work in a real environment. And so if you're doing this from a purple team mindset, you can troubleshoot why things aren't working instantly and to see if you can bypass new detections. That's sort of the cat and mouse game where everyone is helping each other try and level up. And I think that's where purple teaming can really shine. And as I've been talking about through all of these, you're fostering this collaborative culture between the teams. There's been this history of back and forth between red and blue, or especially, for instance, if the blue team's an internal team that works together a lot, and then you hire an external team to come do tests, it can be very adversarial that someone comes in, they basically, they win, quote, they wreck your stuff, they get in, they get domain admin, stuff like that, and then they leave. And that can feel very impersonal. It can also feel like you really weren't given a strong voice in how this was done and whether or not you're going to be able to work off of the results. So that's sort of the key component here, is bringing all these teams together so that they can talk and work with each other. So purple team exercises, how do we do this? Well, we've been doing a lot of purple team exercises in the last 2 years. And so these have almost all been virtual at this point, because otherwise you would get everybody together, you'd sit in a conference room, that kind of thing. But we do have a step-by-step. And so this sort of outlines how we're going to do this. Red teams are creating the emulation plan. The key thing behind purple teams is the metrics. It is the measurable difference before and after. And so part of this is outlining expectations. And we'll dive deeper into this process, but just to give you this idea here, we're going to walk through a tabletop of what we think is going to happen. Then we're going to execute the actual behavior and see if that matches. That's two different data points that you can work off of right away. Is what we expected happening, and is it working as intended? If the answer is no, you can dive into that. That's all good analysis and results right there. And so essentially that's the overview of the entire process, is just that outlining what we want to happen, seeing if it does happen, and then diving into that. So I mentioned before, people, processes, and technology, because you want to make sure that if there is an escalation that's supposed to happen between the tier 1 and tier 2 analysts, what is that event that needs to trigger that? And then can we test that? Can we build a payload that's going to execute that? Have that level 1 analyst say, hey, this needs to be escalated to another team, and go through that process. And to make sure that there's no time delays, that maybe if somebody's out on vacation, you need to make sure that the person that the responsibility falls to is also aware of how that process works. So this is how purple teaming can sort of bring a light on all of those things and help teams improve. So as with a lot of things, I like to start off with a success story, like to give you a vision of where purple teaming can get you depending on where you are. So we at SCYTHE worked with the National Motor Freight Traffic Association, or NMFTA. And so they were super kind in allowing us to actually publish their name and talk about this exercise in the public. So George and Bryson gave a talk at CactusCon last year that went over this entire thing. It's called the real purple juice, not the watered down stuff. I've got a link here in the slides, but just in case you miss a part of this or something like that, or you want to dive in deeper, we do have it recorded, so don't worry. But basically, the thing here was that it was going to be purple team services, 6 weeks of purple teaming. With an assumed breach scenario, SCYTHE was hired to perform all of those 3 roles that we talked about, red, blue, and cyber threat intelligence, and $0 new dollars could be spent on technology. Had to only tune with what we had. And so as part of this, we outlined, there we go. We outlined 6 different weeks of testing. So the first one being baseline testing, just to understand what controls were in place. Then a series of adversaries with scaling sophistication. And some of these things are focused around specific techniques that they use, as well as what is their intent and goal when they are doing intrusion campaigns. And so that's where those middle 4 weeks were all different adversaries. And then the last week was sort of a free play for the red team to test out any sort of tangential things that they saw during the weeks that they wanted to make sure there was either a test case against or something like that. And so this was what was outlined before. This was agreed upon by everybody. And so this was week 1. So that baseline week, 94% of adversary behavior was undetected. And so this is something that's it's a pretty rough starting point, right? No one likes to hear about this. And this talks about the things that were maybe detected or prevented, right? Blocked. That's something everyone likes to see is, oh, we blocked this specific test case. And so there was one thing that got blocked. And I think it was a PowerShell script that got spawned. But besides that, everything else went through. And so, but after, if we go to the 6-week mark here, we get to 64% detected. So a success story here. Now, a little bit more behind it. We enabled telemetry with Sysmon. And so that was a key part of gathering information and gathering the data that you can then work on analysis for detections. And so the site team had to work with Event Sentry, which is a SIM that was in place. And again, can't spend any money on new technology that includes new SIM tools or anything like that. And so we created this additional logic and alerts for it. And Event Sentry was actually published a blog post afterward that sort of talked about how SCYTHE went through this process, because we shared those with Event Sentry. And they, like I said, they published a blog post that sort of breaks everything down. So overall, like, how cool of a result of this, that not only were we allowed to talk about this, the SIM vendor also published a blog post talking about the process and everything that worked well, and released new rules for everyone to use. So this is just, again, this is sort of that vision of success that I think purple teaming can bring to your organization and bring to you. So I did mention we do have the YouTube link. It's right there, the full purple juice, not the watered down stuff. And so there's the link. And I will send the slides out afterward. I'm sure there's already been a question, but slides are available afterward. We do record these and put them on YouTube, so you can watch it again. We have all the previous ones there too. It just takes a few days sometimes to get them uploaded. So should have answered those at the beginning. I apologize, George or Elaine, if you've had to answer more than one of those questions. So let's talk about purple teaming now, like diving into the process. So as far as a purple team exercise checklist, there's a couple major things we need. We need an exercise framework. We need a cyber threat intelligence that's going to link to our emulation plan. And then we need the actual tools to perform the emulation and the reporting. So let's get started on step 1. As far as frameworks and methodologies, I'm going to go over and talk on the next slide is the purple team exercise framework. However, purple teaming is all about applying testing to your organization within whatever frameworks you typically work with. So if you are a team that works already with the cyber kill chain or the unified kill chain, or if you have some regulatory frameworks and testing that you like to do, you can apply purple teaming to all of these. So we don't hold the only purple team methodology. Like I said, it's more of a mindset and how you can apply things. That's where take what you want and apply it within the frameworks that you're familiar with, because it's most important that you are able to sort of have the give and take that comes from purple teaming more than following a very specific methodology or framework. So that's where this is a list of very common ones. You can use these or you can use ours, and that's what I'm going to go through right now. And so part of the reason I'm going through ours, besides being biased because this is from SCYTHE, is that a lot of the challenges, and this was something when I was at MITRE, that the most common question we got about attack was, well, how do I operationalize attack? Like, how does somebody take attack and use it? Like, I need training on that. I need someone to walk me through it. And so George is someone that's also worked with some standardization communities and stuff in the past, and knows all of the challenges that come with trying to create a framework as well as trying to apply it. So part of this was outlining very specific steps and roles so that we could potentially head off anybody that had those questions and sort of answer it for them. So and this is the link. It's the Purple Team Exercise Framework. And there we go. We're going to start with roles and responsibilities. As I mentioned, we outline everything here. And so these are all of the different roles and responsibilities that we have for the Purple Team Exercise Framework. A lot of these are potentially your sponsor. As I mentioned before, you can also, depending on the expertise of your team, who you have, you can perform multiple of these roles yourself. You can do the cyber threat intelligence, you can do the red team, you can do the blue team. If you're brought in for those things and have the appropriate, of course, permissions and expertise. Now, one role that I will say that you should carve out and have a separate person is the exercise coordinator here. This is the final one. They have the biggest block for responsibility because they are essentially responsible for recording everything that happens. It's good if this person has a little bit of understanding of the techniques that are going to be used, but it's not a requirement. Making sure that it's somebody that can keep cadence, and that's why we have the name here as sort of project manager. And so this is a role that's going to be directing everything. And so I would say if you have somebody that's extremely responsible and is good at sort of leading teams, you're going to want to put them in this role because the red team, the blue team, those types of things, blue team is oftentimes going to be potentially a separate team, and or the red team is going to be. So you're only going to have responsibility for one of those. So that just depends. You can fill in vendors here for specific roles as well. Just a couple different ways to fill it out. But after you've identified who will be in what roles, the next question is how long to spend on a purple team. So that's something, another common question we get is, well, I haven't ever done a purple team. Should I do a full couple days one, or should I just do like 2 hours? And so my answer to that is, like most things, it depends. Now, a couple different answers I'll give, and the context around them is you can run a purple team for like an hour or two. And the really important thing here, and we'll get into this in more in depth in a minute, is scoping it appropriately. If you're going to do a 2-hour purple team, you probably shouldn't focus on either more than a few test cases, like 1 or 2, or you just need to have like a couple of sync points throughout the week. Maybe it's something that could be handed off between teams at different points, but for the most part, you want everybody together. And so if you can only get everybody together for an hour, try and get in a single test. Pick something that is going to be the most important thing, whether it's a specific lateral movement technique or some discovery technique that happens on the host or endpoint. Those are the types of things that we'll walk through how to identify, but picking one thing and going through the entire purple team process with that one thing is going to be hugely beneficial, and it's going to be more beneficial than doing longer things that maybe that's going to take more resources. It's going to require a higher level of like business justification. And so I know of a lot of folks that are trying to build out internal purple team capabilities. And my answer there is always start small and work your way up, because the advantage of having metrics with purple teams is that you can argue and showcase the value that you get from them. And so that tends to be something that a lot of people like to see. Anything that's measurable means that you can see sort of success fail criteria, and you can see exactly what it bought you. And so I lead, like I mentioned, our services. I've walked people through their first purple team engagement. We'll do a full day, and we'll do 20 to 30, sometimes up to like 35 different techniques. And that's pretty much a full 8 hours. So it's pretty in depth. It's something that, I recommend people start small and then build it up if you've never done one before, or you can, if you can leverage someone like myself or somebody else on your team, or another organization that's done purple teaming, that they can help you jump to higher levels of purple team quicker. So with that, logistics. Right now, most things are still remote. So that's where virtual tends to be, at least for here in the States, is what we've been doing here for the past 18 months. However, I can definitely see at some point that you get everybody in a conference room, and it allows for that transition of different analysts and stuff like that to happen more seamlessly. People can say, all right, here, I'd pass it to this person. And the way we do that virtually is screen sharing. It's really important to do screen shares. I know some people don't like to do it, but this is so super critical during a purple team exercise for someone to show what their screen is, what their process that they would go through, what links that they click, what dashboards they look at before escalating. And then we would say, all right, it got escalated to another team. Now screen share with that other team. And so that's how we sort of move through the teams and move through the people in the process part of this, because the technology is what they're working with. So that's where, if you get everybody in a room, collaboration tends to be a little bit stronger, but we've seen a lot of really good success with using a platform like Zoom for virtual and remote testing and purple teams. And so we've had a lot of success with teams, and we've been doing that now for, like I said, a year and a half. So as far as target systems, this is another fun question discussion we often get, because we talk about ransomware emulations. And so we always are like, test in production. And people say, how can you possibly test ransomware in production without having somebody just, whether it's a risk manager or someone like that says, no way. And we'll get into this, and you'll see exactly how we do that when we get into the lab. But the importance of testing on production is because that's where the real environment is. That's where all of your defensive tools are. And this is, as part of a purple team, I want to go up against all of those tools. I want every single tool that you have, all the tunings, all of the extra detections, all of those things. If nothing else, and I've yet to encounter an organization where this has happened, where we go in, everything is either blocked or detected, and it flashes on someone's screen. It's super easy, and they see it. And we all, at the end of the day, just say, all right, well, we just validated that everything worked. I would love to go in and have that happen. I've yet for it to happen. So if you think your organization is that good, like, kudos to you. Most folks know that some things are going to get through because either they've tested the technique before, they don't have the necessarily the right logs to work off that information. So they're working with what they have. And so that's why it's really important to test in production. That also helps you as security analysts or managers to potentially ask for more budget and things like that if you do need more tools or more data, essentially, to detect adversary behaviors. So any tuning, all of that extra noise that happens from people sending emails, browsing the web, that kind of thing, is also in your environment. So sometimes we've seen if you're doing a purple team, or you're doing sort of a transparent red team, is what I've done in the past for organizations, and you're doing it in a test bed that they've set up, they can tune the detections up. And so anything that pops up, they can essentially shoot down and say, oh, we'd be good. But none of those things would work in the real environment. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that testing in production is super important. I know people get worried about that, but also remember adversaries are going to be interacting with your real environment. And so that's what we're trying to do with purple teaming, is the adversary emulation and doing those behaviors so that you can test it and look at these things and hopefully sort of figure out whether or not that your organization is as prepared as you think they are to deal with real adversaries. So that's why I mentioned this before. We do want all of the security tools to be enabled, all of the data collectors, all the log collectors, whether it's Sysmon, if you have your own EDR or your own sort of defensive stack, these things should all be there. Ideally, if you do have like a forensics, like digital forensics incident response playbook and toolkit, we have those things on hand so that you can run those and test that process too. That's not something that every organization has, because sometimes they would have an external party come after an incident. So as far as bringing the right people to the table, just making sure you understand exactly when you're going to hit that sort of roadblock and say, all right, this is where the point that, you know, our chief information security officer is going to call this person. And so that can be sort of recorded, and at least that's recorded in part of your process. So with that, let's talk about how to scope your test. As I mentioned, this is super important. This is the cyber kill chain that most folks are familiar with. What most of, as far as scoping the test, and we're going to talk about sort of a specific part here. I'm a big fan of assume breach, and that's why we're going to talk about the last two here. So as far as recon, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, all of that stuff is good. You can do purple teams on that. A lot of times teams are doing, whether it's phishing email tests or other things to test different parts of this kill chain. Between insider threats, between the large number of 0 days we've seen deployed for initial access in 2021 alone, those types of things may allow adversaries to essentially skip most of these. It can be hard to detect those, especially depending on what your team already has to do. And so the focus can be on where the adversaries really have to interact with the users and the workstations in your environment. And that's where these last two, the actions on objectives and the command and control, because that's going to be your network and your host and endpoint for that actions on objectives. So those are key parts where hopefully you have a lot of logging and data and the ability to analyze those things, because that's where the majority of most folks' defensive security controls are deployed. So that's where we're going to focus. So after you've scoped that, and hopefully that's, you know, it's a quick slide, but it's really important. I have written an entire blog post that sort of covers all of those specific individual reasons why assumed breach is something that you can argue, because it tends to be a mindset shift from folks that have been doing this potentially for a long time. It can be a, you know, why should we assume that someone gets in? Shouldn't red teamers or pen testers, shouldn't we make them break down the doors? Which potentially you might want to do that as part of your test. But these days, if it takes them 2 weeks or 3 weeks to find a way in, and then they get domain admin in 3 hours, most of the tests would have, if you shortened down those first 3 weeks and just focused on what happened afterward, you're probably going to get a lot more value out of your test. So that's sort of my pitch and argument for assumed breach, but happy to hear additional thoughts on that as well. So as far as our exercise flow goes, I mentioned this is our 6-step process that sort of encompasses the entire purple team exercise framework. Step 1, exercise coordinator is going to present the cyber threat intelligence behind what they're testing, and then a specific adversary, TTP, and then the technical details. And we'll get into this, but it's things like, this is going to be executed with command line. Here's how we did our initial access spawn in this scenario, because oftentimes with assumed breach, you do want to have some identified scenario so that you have an entire story, and it's sort of a narrative to give to your senior leadership team and that kind of thing, as this is how we're accounting for a potential 0 day that gets an adversary access, is that we are starting with an assumed breach scenario. Someone essentially gets to plant their malware, and that's where they start. and here's how we are able to respond to that. And so that's going to be what the exercise coordinator helps set the stage for that. Afterward, you're going to have this tabletop discussion. Step 2, we're going into what are the expectations, what's supposed to happen after this initial piece of malware lands, and what are the security controls we expect to trigger. Is anything going to trigger, or what events are going to be logged? So this can be the first point where it reveals that maybe you all have 10 different products. And as you go through this with each of the steps, you really find out only 3 or 4 are actually expected to do anything. And so maybe those other 6 are for something else, but that's sort of the first data point that if your tools are not expected to, are you essentially bought them with the expectation that they're going to do something and they're not part of that response process, this is where you, again, start getting data points and why purple teaming can expose some things really quickly. So after you have that and say, our EDR is going to potentially respond here, it may block it. And this is the expectation. Dive into as much depth as you can on that. Do you expect them to block it because maybe it's run DLL 32, and that's a technique that's been really well profiled because ransomware threat actors have been using that, and we expect our EDR to block it? Or is it a group policy because you are following the recommendations from NIST or something like that? Those types of things, if you can drill down, the deeper you can get on expectations, the more it will sort of reveal what things should happen in what order. And that way, the more you can drill down, if those don't happen, you can go into why. And so that's where step 3, we're going to have the red team or the red team tool is going to run that TTP. And so that can be a specific procedure here. It could be a command line. It could be a series of them if you're trying to test across execution methods. And then the blue team is going to follow through in their process. And so if they are looking for specific telemetry, logs, that kind of thing, a lot of times if the discovery or the flow here is with a discovery technique, you'll oftentimes see logs of these things, but not detections yet, because anyone could be doing these. They are common for system admins to use. So that's where sometimes it's maybe, yes, we've got it logged, but this isn't enough yet for it to trigger an actual alert or response. And then if you do have detection engineering, because you have a team that does this, or the expectation is that if this already has a detection that's not working, how do we fix it? It's either how do we fix it or how do we write a detection that will take into account this use case, and can we deploy it? If you can, that's great, because you can then repeat this, go to step 1 with this exact same technique and validate that should work. And so you can go through this whole process again and say, all right, our tabletop discussion is going to say that our previously engineered detection is now going to catch this. And so now you walk through the process and you can see and troubleshoot. And so that's where, like I said, it's a very 6-step, it's pretty straightforward, and it's very deliberate. That's something that a lot of times, coming from the red team side of things, and my fellow red teamers, when trying to do some of these, can feel a little less dynamic when you're going through some purple teams, because you have agreed upon the test. If something gets blocked or stopped or whatever, maybe your first instinct of, oh, well, maybe I could modify this and get around it. It's like, that's not the point of this test. And so this is a very structured way of doing it. And that's why we've had a lot of success with it. And I think this is a good place to start for people that haven't done purple teaming before. So now we are through with our first check, our exercise framework. Let's move on to cyber threat intelligence and an emulation plan. So I really love this chart. I bring it up all the time when talking to our customers and doing any sort of discussions around cyber threat intelligence and how we build tests. So this is David Bianco's pyramid of adversary pain. And so let's talk about what these mean. And this is, if you can change these, how hard is it for an attacker on the right side here, or on my screen? How hard is it for an attacker to modify the behavior? And so we get down to hash values. Hash values are super easy to change because they are unique per file. And if anything changes, then that's going to change. Now, these also are the easiest things for you to integrate into your SIM to look for across your network. And so that's where it can be really easy to integrate new hashes in if you get them from threat feeds or things like that. But it's also super easy for adversaries to change these things. So it doesn't have that big of impact. Let's move up to IP addresses, domain names. I like to lump these together now often because of cloud infrastructure. It's made it easy and great for organizations to spin up essentially endless IT infrastructure that they need or want. It also allows adversaries to scale up any new infrastructure they need or want. And so with that, it is also basically getting to the point where it's trivial for these types of things as well, because they can either use a different provider or things like that. And it's relatively small change on their tools because they have been scaling. Now, let's talk about where you start to have some impact. Network and host artifacts are really going to be the first part. If there's a specific path or a specific command and control channel that adversaries really like to use that's unique, if you can block that or you can profile it and analyze it, this is where they're going to have to change some of these things. Now, I talk to a lot of defenders, and so what I like to remind them is that adversaries are teams of people as well. They have experts as well that they have to request time from, that those experts need to do research. And all these ransomware groups still have to get time from people. And so that's where when you start impacting the tools that they're doing, it requires new software engineers to build a new set of tools or for something to operate a different way. And then if we get to the very peak of the pyramid, this is the TTPs, this is those adversary behaviors. If you force somebody to go and operate, if they've been using Windows command line, right? Just think of yourself. If you've been using Windows command line your entire life, and then somebody tells you, nope, can't use that anymore. Not like you can only use sometimes. You can only use PowerShell now. Well, technically, people might make the argument PowerShell is more powerful or something like that. But that shift that's a major mindset shift. That's something you have to figure out how to do everything in this new language and things like that. And this is on Windows, and there's even some things that work between them. So when we get to that point, you are changing how people approach a problem or approach trying to ransom a company. If you can force them to change their behaviors, you are going to have major impact on their ability to succeed. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about moving up the pyramid of pain here, is you want to inflict as much pain as possible. And by having detections that are picking up on some generic behaviors as opposed to a very specific hash, you make the adversaries work that much harder. So now this is not the cyber kill chain, but it looks very similar. And this talks about how we can take cyber threat intelligence or all of those reports that you see from different cyber threat intelligence vendors that'll maybe list a series of campaigns that a threat actor or a piece of malware has been seen on, and they'll basically categorize all the different techniques and things like that. How do you take that and distill it into an actual plan? Now, these days, it's a little bit easier. In the last year or two, it's been easier to do than it was 3 or 4 years ago because of MITRE ATT&CK. And so I'm a big advocate for ATT&CK, being from MITRE. And this is two of my former colleagues, Katie Nichols, who is the director of threat intelligence at Red Canary, and Cody Thomas, who's over at SpecterOps. They did a talk that basically went over how to do threat-based adversary emulation with MITRE ATT&CK. And so this was the methodology that they developed as a result. And we're going to walk through each sort of steps on how you would go through and take an adversary and build an adversary emulation plan. So just going through and understanding your target org. If you're an external organization doing research on, maybe there's a specific, maybe it's a pharmaceutical industry company that you can work with. And so you can search that in ATT&CK. And so for those of you that aren't familiar with ATT&CK, you can go to attack.mitre.org. and you don't have to put the ampersand. You can spell out attack. But this is what it looks like. This is probably a little bit outdated because they keep expanding the matrix. But overall, the key things here are across the top, you have your 10,000 foot view. These are the tactics. And these are the different goals that the adversaries are trying to achieve. And that's where you have reconnaissance, resource development, initial access, that kind of thing. Under each of those in a column is going to be all of the techniques. And then where it got a little bit more complicated was when we added sub-techniques and then procedures. And those get into increasing levels of detail about how adversaries are achieving these overall large goals that they have. And so what it essentially became is a resource for cyber threat intelligence that has been analyzed and has been mapped into a single framework. Now, this is great for defenders because everything in MITRE ATT&CK has been seen in a real world compromise. This isn't just research, and not that there's anything wrong with research, but part of the challenge is keeping up with what real threats are doing. And if real threats take research and they incorporate it into their malware, most groups these days are trying to scale their activities. They're trying to scale what they're doing. And so they're going to use only specific techniques that scale. And that's the type of thing that if you are an individual red team or researcher or that kind of thing, you have the benefit of essentially being able to tinker with things to make sure that they're going to run on a very specific environment, when as an adversary and as a group, they're going to target multiple organizations and they don't have the time, effort, or resources to essentially go and tinker potentially with each one. And so that's what's sort of important. This is still a lot to take in. I'll say MITRE does have some free training on how to use attack because they did hear about all the questions about operationalizing it. So I'd encourage you to check out some of their training if you're interested in diving deeper into this, because I could spend a full couple hours on it. So as far as how they actually go through and extract TTPs, because this process, and this is again from the attacking the status quo. So this was a FireEye report, and it essentially just shows how this is a paragraph from Cyber Threat Intelligence report and how you can go and extract out different techniques. Now you'll also notice some S numbers there. So you have like an S then a number, and a T, then a number. And so those are shorthand for like the technique ID, or for S, you have like software. So not only do they have specific techniques, but they have like, there's all this fun between different threat groups and then the malware they use. And sometimes they use multiple pieces of malware. And so depending on the group, how do you categorize whether they do all of the things that each piece of malware uses or not? You can split all that out in any way you want with the attack framework. And so they have it all mapped, including everybody's favorite tool, Cobalt Strike. And so they have all the different techniques and capabilities of Cobalt Strike mapped out to attack. So if you aren't sure if you have a specific threat group, but you have a piece of malware or a specific tool that you want to work from, that is a way to start. So they also have Attack Navigator. So this is a way to sort of showcase and communicate what the breadth of testing, or potentially the depth of testing, if you're looking at just a specific tactic. So this is a good way to communicate to senior leadership. Attack has become very big, and so most people have heard of it, at least at that point. They may not know exactly what it is, but if you point to this and say, this is the type of things, and can talk to a little bit what you're doing, it provides a nice view for everything you are doing. I think it's Matt Graber did a great job of mapping out and tagging specific techniques and like controls and things like that you could do. So there's people have like taken these tools and like gone far beyond with them. And that's really, I think, the power of the community, is taking these things, adding to it. And so I'm giving you sort of a starting point with a few of these, but I'd encourage you to do some of your own research on how other folks are using these, because there may be use cases that are more specific to you, your industry, your organization, that I'm not going to be able to cover because either I just don't know about them, I'm not in your industry, that kind of thing. And so these are sort of starting points that people have rallied around. And I'd encourage you again to seek out some that are specific to you. So after we've gathered and decided on our adversary, we have to we've gotten some cyber threat intelligence. We have to sort of analyze it to figure out, pulling out those techniques. How do we put it together? So one way you could do this is just by tactic. Now, order of operations does matter though for some adversaries, because depending on what they're trying to do, a good example is some adversaries that are trying to steal IP. They are oftentimes less concerned with operational security. And so the big thing is, can they get in, get your IP, and get out before you can detect them? Because even if you detect them after the fact, it doesn't matter. They got what they came for. Now, then you have other threat actors that are maybe doing intelligence gathering or really trying to keep access. And so that's where operational security becomes really important to them. So when we talk about like SolarWinds and you read through some of that, there were significant time delays and things like that in between callbacks to ensure that it would be very difficult to detect using a lot of the tools that people currently had. And so how you want to make sure those things map to the testing you're going to do, this is going to be the place where you decide, do we want to do a defense evasion first, or do we not even want to worry about that? We want to see if somebody's trying to smash in the front door and grab something, do we want to test our detections against that first? So this is your opportunity to see that. And we'll go through an example here in a minute too, so you can see exactly what that looks like just beyond an unfilled one. And emulation plans, we have Threat Thursdays. Everyone can go and read these things. And so that's what, as we have on the last bullet point there, they're available to the community for free. It talks about how we at SCYTHE, that's mostly George and myself these days, have gone through and looked at different cyber threat intelligence reports, that kind of thing, and we've put it together. Now, part of the reason we outline exactly where we got our sources is you may have your own private cyber threat intelligence feeds that gives you information that we don't have. And so maybe it's more specific to your industry or your organization if you have your own internal team. And so this is where, if there are deviations from that, that's perfectly okay. And but we provide these so that it can be sort of a framework and a blueprint for you to work off of, because oftentimes trying to approach all of attack and trying to distill it down, it can be very intimidating for folks. And so use them, look at them, and take from them and use them in your own testing. So let us know how you like them and how they work. So showing you a analyze and organize orange worm, which is something we're going to be going through in the lab as well. So this just does that quick breakdown of, here's the description of what they're trying to do, here's who they targeted, as well as here are the different specific techniques that we're going to be testing. And so this just has a laundry list of the different techniques. You can go into as much or as little detail as you want here, but the idea is that you could essentially send this to whoever you're going to run a test against and say, here's what we're going to test. And they can, give you a yes or no. So after we've done that, we're going to assume that we got approval, everyone was okay with our plan. Let's go into how we would actually do reporting and emulation tools. Oh. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So we have a couple of options here. The first one is good old-fashioned Excel. This is what a lot of cyber threat intelligence analysts use. I know Katie Nichols is a big fan of Excel. And so Excel is a potentially a great option here. And especially if you're not looking to add additional tools to your arsenal to do this. You have Excel, you've been using it. You don't want to potentially go through procurement or setting up a tool. And so it's something that works and it gets you up and running quickly. And I think that's what is the most beneficial thing here, is trying to figure out what will get you the results that you can use to potentially expand your purple team efforts. And that's where use what you have. So this is Vector. Vector is a free tool. It's made by SRA, and you can go download it. They've got a Docker container set up. We have a SCYTHE integration with this as well. But the key thing here is you can see it's broken into left and right. It's got the red team details and the blue team details. And so you're probably not going to be able to read a ton of the text, but overall, the key thing here is that you can record specific things for the red team and notes on what was tested. And then on the blue team, you can say, was this detected? Was it blocked? If it wasn't detected, was it at least logged? And then you can tag the specific security products as well as whether there was an alert and like the level of severity and that kind of thing. So the key thing here, again, is going to be recording and reporting. And so if you are going to be the exercise coordinator, I highly suggest you potentially look and evaluate at some of these tools because they can save you a lot of time and effort. The other one, the paid one, is called PlexTrack. And so it also has a breakdown of specific techniques. It has the red side and the blue side, as well as some additional reporting that you can use and sort of templating. You can do some analysis over time. And so, like I said, excuse me, it is a paid for tool. But that's, again, this is another tool that we work closely with PlexTrack on having integration so that we can provide exercise coordinators and people doing this with as much help as possible, because it is a lot to do during your purple team engagements to try and record everything. And so making that as automated and as easy as possible is really what we're going after. So this is, again, exercise coordinator. This is why you want them to be your most responsible person, is that they're going to have to go through, in addition to taking all the notes and outlining every technique as you're going through it, they should be sending out, setting expectations. If there were action items that are assigned to people, those are all going to be coming from the exercise coordinator. And so they're going to have to record a lessons learned, and that's always going to take additional time, effort, energy. So I think this is something, I'll let you all read through the rest of them, the rest of the bullet points here, but the summary is that they're going to be responsible for maintaining that tempo throughout the engagement, whether it's a 2-hour thing or a 2 days. Man, my keyboard here is failing me. All right, so diving into emulation tools. So we do want to automate as much of this process, especially when you start moving past single tests. And so this is where there's an open source, essentially the open source C2 matrix project. You can go check it out. It's got basically a big Google sheet, I think, of all of the different C2 frameworks, because a ton of them were released. There was sort of a offensive security renaissance period of everyone creating and building C2 frameworks. Some are still under active development, others are not, but this allows you to compare them for your specific use case. So they have, if you have a very specific C2 channel that you want to test, whether it's HTTP, DNS, that kind of thing, there's also tools like SCYTHE are also in here. And so you can draw comparisons and sort of see how things go. But I'd highly recommend checking this out, especially if you're getting started. They have a questionnaire you can fill out if you're trying to select the C2 and you don't want to read through the entire thing. So check it out. Follow them on Twitter. They always add new ones. Anytime a researcher publishes a new one, you'll see folks like George and Adam and a few other people that help support it will all essentially say, oh, we need to add this one. And so they'll go through and they'll do an evaluation and add it. So also, I'm sure they take requests. So if there's some project you've seen that isn't on there, just ask. And then, of course, let's talk about SCYTHE. This is our enterprise grade platform for adversary emulation. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because you're going to get to use it in the lab. But basically, the idea here is that we want something to provide you something that you can be confident in running in your production, as I talked about, and can do that repeatable testing. So it will do all the things. It's built with purple teaming in mind. And so that's something I just like to highlight, and you'll see, you'll get a much better pitch when we're actually walking through this. Oh man, there we go. So here's our overall features and capabilities. You'll get to see all these things. Our key integrations are with Atomic Red Team, your SIM, whether it's Splunk, we can do syslog, and then of course, the reporting and tracking with PlexTrack and Vector. So now that we have everything, let's walk through a purple team exercise for a single technique and just to give you an idea of what it would look like. So we're going to go through all 6 steps here. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the detection engineering portion, and then we're going to hop into the lab. So we're almost there. So the first thing you're going to do as the exercise coordinator, you're going to present a TTP, and it might be something like this. You've got your command running with command line. You're going to run it with just run host name. And so maybe you have specific cyber threat intelligence that you're going to cite that says, here's a specific piece of malware, here's a specific adversary. And then I've got like a semantic blog there. That's sort of the report that we sourced this from. You're going to fill out what the expected result is and expected response. So I created a company, and this is just a fake company. And so we'll say, you know, they've got pretty good logging. They have sysmon. And so the expected result is that they are going to have logs of it and that the sysmon will log it out, but there's not going to be an alert because this is mostly something that people run in our environment all the time. So this is an okay expectation to have, and even a good one. So after that, there we go. We're going to execute this procedure. So this is the red team. This is a screenshot from SCYTHE just to give you an idea of what it looks like when something's run. We have a timestamp. We can correlate that with our logs on when we expect it to come in. Now, I mentioned like a few key data points. When this is executed versus when the logs hit the SIM is a really important metric, because while most folks on here might say, all right, we've got, we think this is going to be 3 minutes or 5 minutes or something like that. There's a chance that this may be hours or something like that, depending on how your network is architected. And so that's something that we have discovered on some purple team engagements, is that it did take significantly longer than the team expected for those logs to hit the SIM. And if you're waiting and waiting and waiting and nothing's happening, that's something that's worth diving into and diagnosing. And so that can be a huge find in a purple team. And that provides the SOC with a ton of information on how they can respond to things. And like I said, they can go to senior management with a pretty good argument for either more resources or things like that to deploy any new tools or technologies, because they may need those to speed up response times. So after that, we can say, what's our detection process? So with SCYTHE, one of the key ways that I provide, or one of the key points I normally provide, is the process ID that our client is running as. And so with that, for instance, in this one, we will look at winlog beat, and it's going to be, and this is on the elk stack, so that's why you're going to see beats from that. And we're going to work a little bit with Kibana and Elastic in the lab. So giving you a little bit of a preview here. So you can search by process ID and see what's coming up. And so we've got some hits, and this is where you would do that screen share as you're looking through the dashboard. So once you start diving into the actual response, this is where we get to the actual detection engineering. So, I all credit to Olaf for basically having this really great detection engineering cycle. And I'm all about not reinventing the wheel and just highlighting experts when they have really, really good processes to follow through, because that is really important, is sort of giving you this mindset and this way to tackle how to do detection engineering. So we're going to walk through how you would do this with this very specific command. So the first step is breaking it down into hypothesize. So a couple ways that we can do this. We can break out that command line. Can we detect command line at all, right? Regardless of what's run. That might be the first sort of super general question that we're going to ask. After that, okay, we have command line logs coming in through sysmon. Are we going to be able to detect specific arguments on here? There are some EDRs and some that will only present that something was executed on the command line. Command line.exe was called, or cmd.exe was called, and there's no information beyond that. And so that's a really important thing to know, because your ability to understand whether something was a false positive is going to be directly related to the types of data and analysis that you can perform. And so then we're going to link this to an attack technique just to make sure we can map everything for both what we're testing on the red side and detections on the blue side together. After this, we're doing our research. So we're going to check data sources to see, maybe you don't know whether or not it's going to be able to detect it, but you're familiar with what types of things would come in. MITRE has been really focused on building out their data sources and for this year, and that's really what they've been working on that. And I think I just saw that they were finalizing their October release. They're working on sort of the final polish that's going to further dive into data sources and mapping that to detections. And so this is a screenshot from MITRE attack. It has the data sources for this specific technique. That's why it's, again, important to map these things to attack when you can. And so do we have command execution? Do we have OS API execution or process creation? Are those things that we can detect? Those may be additional questions that you end up getting to fill out. And you can see how a single command can very quickly grow out the number of questions that you're going to do. And so this is why people always ask, well, one command over 2 hours, like, wouldn't we be done really quickly? Not if you're doing it this way. So, and then of course, where do we get these? Are we expecting sysmon? Is this going to be Windows event log at EDR agent? There's different organizations all have different ways of doing this. So I think what I said for this one was that since we expected sysmon, that's what we're expecting. And then this is where you actually get into the analysis of, can we hunt for something like this? Can we look for new processes spawned from cmd.exe? Can we look for specific command line arguments? Because this is going to give you the information on, are we able to, if we can't detect this, if this isn't detected, can we build a detection to actually do this? And what are the ways that we're going to be able to come at that command from multiple different angles? Because you may need to narrow it down in a way that doesn't work for another organization, because maybe you have a tool. This is a very common thing, especially when people talk about like blocking PowerShell. Or even looking at encoded PowerShell. There are IT automation tools that in the background, behind the scenes, are passing around encoded PowerShell. And so if you flag on that, and your SIM might just get flooded overnight, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're under attack. Well, it turns out, no, it was this tool just provisioning a couple of new workstations for new employees that started yesterday. And so that's the kind of thing that is going to be really environment dependent, and also can be super frustrating for you as maybe a set of analysts or people that are looking to integrate in all these detections, and then it sets off a bunch of false alarms, and you got to tune these things down. And so that's what's really important about understanding where you are able to come at this from. So as far as the research, this is as you do some of these queries to see if you can see this log file essentially from a couple of different angles. How do we build detections for this? And so the other example I like to give here is there other information or context that's going to make this malicious. Now, when we're talking about that, let's talk about like metadata, like things like that. Is this being spawned by Notepad, right? If host cmd taxi host name is spawned by Notepad, that's probably suspicious, right? That seems like a very odd way to run host name, and why would Notepad need to do that? And the same thing, interpreter, that's one of the key things that I don't know if it still actually spawns notepad.exe, but Notepad probably shouldn't be talking to the internet, especially not over port 4444. But those are things that context really matters around these things. And so anytime you have a command like this that might be more generic and you're trying to determine the intent behind it, adding data or data sources, it may require linking things together in order to actually tag whether it's malicious or not. So with that, we've essentially gone through, I think, the majority of this cycle. And the last one is tying everything back into your Purple Team exercise framework recording. And so this is where you're going to have basically the exercise coordinator is going to record it. They would basically have this. We verified that sysmon logged it. through event ID 1, and then there was no alert as expected. And then you can move on to the next one. And so again, just to provide an alternative view, if there was an alert that was supposed to happen and it didn't, or something alerted and it wasn't supposed to, those are really nice investigations that would all come out of this single procedure. And so there's a lot that can be done here. I find every organization, they think they know pretty well what's going to happen, and there's always something that pops up. So, and that's happened without fail across all the purple teams we've done. And that's what I was just trying to think if there are any exceptions, but most of the time we find at least something, whether it's a detection that they didn't know existed or something else. So highly recommend going through this at least with one thing just to see how it goes, and then repeat this for every new procedure you have after that. So after you've done your purple teaming 1 or 2 times, you can then look at the purple maturity model. And I've got sort of a blog post that walks through exactly what each of these steps means. But the key thing here is that a lot of teams are overly geared towards detection engine understanding, and they have a SOC because, again, everyone needs defenders. Not everyone necessarily has the budget, time, resources to essentially have attackers. But if you have all of these detections, how are you validating that they work? That when a real threat comes along, they are going to trigger as you would expect. And that's where security testing comes in and threat understanding comes in, because how building tests that real attackers are doing requires having some understanding of what the real threats are, how they're executing these things. And I've found there are very few people that can keep up with both really well. So there are some, but I would say those people are few and far between. And that means that most organizations are going to have to pick one or the other and essentially supplement their capability with either tools or something like that, or an outside team. And so this is where trying to make sure that you can validate the tests, that if nothing else from a purple team, hopefully you can say, we expected this to happen. It did happen. That in and of itself is a metric that's worth recording. So something that I just like to highlight. Like I said, I break all these things down, but I do want to get you into the lab. So let's go to hands-on time. Last shout out I'll make here, if I can get my slides to all switch, is that we do have a swag store. So you can see my SCYTHE Unicorn t-shirt here. We've got, we also have like hats. We have things for dogs, babies. We have hoodies. Pretty much anyone can wear some unicorn swag. So, and you'll save the chubby unicorns, also known as rhinos. So with that, let me stop my share while I jump into a lab. That I don't have. Lane, can you provision me one? Or I might have one.
Looking.
Okay. So with that, looks like this is, so for any reason you do not have a link, please don't sit silent. I want you to jump into this lab. Anyone can do it. I promise there's no like minimum technical expertise or anything you need. Everyone can go into this lab and be successful and play around with it. So we have one of our sales folks. I don't know if he's on this, but Yoni he's awesome. He did not have a technical background, and he goes through, he builds the threats. I mean, and that's something that, I think I'm proud of from our tool standpoint, is that it doesn't need to have a high bar in order to get use out of this, to understand how to use it. And so all credit to him for being confident enough to give it a try the first time. And, we've been working together now for 7 months. And so now he's a purple team expert too. But overall, like I said, you can give it a shot. We've had a couple of people. The reason I bring this up is we've had a couple of people sit silent that were, just like, oh, my lab didn't work. We never got something. I'm like, please, like, send us a chat. I promise it's not annoying us. It's all for you to join us during this part, and then we can work together on it.